Hello and welcome to the Final Ghost podcast. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Ghost Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, every season we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism, looking at a particular trope in depth. We are almost done with our current series dedicated to vampires, or as I've been referring to them over the last 18 episodes, the most elegant and the horniest of movie monsters. In each episode, I'm joined by a special guest to dive deep into a vampire movie or two, where we contextualize them, try not to thirst too much, and think about what works and what doesn't. And in today's episode, we continue our exploration of the vampire revival of the noughties. First up, we are tackling Neil Jordan's return to the vampire genre with his 2012 film Byzantium, where a mother-daughter vampire duo, played by Gemma Arterton and Saoirse Ronan, are being pursued by an ancient society of patriarchal vampires. And in the second half of the episode, we discuss arthouse darling Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers Left Alive. Extremely cool, very sad take on the vampire, starring Tom Hiddleston and the legendary Tilda Swinton as two vampire lovers who lounge around, read books, listen to records, and just generally have a lovely time. I'm joined in this episode by vampire expert, author, scholar, and founding member of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies, Dr. Sirka Nieline, who also kicked off this series with a deep dive into 3 very different Dracula adaptations. And this entire vampire season is made possible with the support of Arrow Video, who bring out the very best in cult horror and genre films, specializing in definitive home entertainment editions. Their collection now spans more than 500 physical releases, and they've just launched the Arrow Player, which is their own streaming service. Throughout this entire season, we are recommending a film that we love from their collection. And this week, in the spirit of Byzantium being a spiritual follow-up to Interview with a Vampire, we pick the much applauded sequel to the Hitchcock classic Psycho. It's Psycho 2. It's not a very interesting title, but it's a great film. Directed by Richard Franklin, who also made the very fabulous Road Games, and with a script by Tom Holland, who's the director of Fright Night, this is an incredibly effective sequel that sees Norman Bates return to his family home and motel after 2 decades in a mental institution. If you enjoyed this episode, do consider supporting us on Patreon. We are publishing bonus episodes and full spoilerific discussions of new releases. If you are so inclined and you're able to support us, head over to patreon.com/thefinalgirls. And with all of that said, if you are new to the podcast, please know that we discuss the films in detail pretty much from the very beginning. So if you are averse to any conversation about a film that you have not seen yet, do consider this your spoiler warning. And if you really don't mind, please enjoy our deep dive discussion into Byzantium and Only Lovers Left Alive. Sirka, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast. How have you been?
I've been well, Anna. How have you been? It's been a great series.
Thank you. It's been, now that we're coming towards the end of it, it feels like there's another few episodes to come, but it almost feels like we started the vampire series with you, and we're kind of finishing it off with you as well.
I've come back with a vengeance.
So we're going to be chatting about 2 quite contemporary vampire films, and when I was rewatching them, they felt very like they were speaking to each other in ways that I had not realized even when I paired them together. So I'd like to start with our chat about Byzantium from 2012 first.
My story can never be told. I write all I know of it, and then I throw the pages to the wind. My mother lives on human blood and has done for 2 centuries. There is a code that we survive by, Eleanor. Keep it.
Eleanor's written a story. In her story, she says that she lives with vampires. She is an aberration.
We are a brotherhood. There are no women amongst us.
We should not permit her to survive. comes a time in life when secrets should be told. You've got secrets, haven't you?
I am 16 forever. I walk, and the past walks with me.
I followed you for many years.
We have to leave. I don't want to lie anymore. I've told you how I live. I'm never merciful, and knowledge is a fatal thing.
If you kiss me right now, will I live forever?
You've told your little boyfriend all about us, haven't you? No! Forgive me for what I must do.
First of all, can you talk a little bit about your relationship with the film? This is Neil Jordan's return to vampire stories after, obviously, Interview with a Vampire. When did you first see Byzantium, and did you have kind of expectations of it because of Interview with a Vampire?
I saw it, I'm trying to remember when I saw it. I think I saw it, weirdly enough, I think I saw it on television, which is very unusual for me. Usually I'd buy things way. It's either that or I ended up borrowing a copy, I can't remember. But anyway, I do remember when I saw it, I was thinking, I had a lot of expectations because Neil Jordan's Interview with the Vampire, which I know you've covered before, but Neil Jordan's Interview with the Vampire is so deeply personally important to me because that was my first vampire film that I snuck into in the cinema when I was about 14, and it changed my life. There's just no other way to kind of put it. And more so than the novel. The novel I had read and I liked it, but the film just visually gorgeous. They brought it to life. So for me, when you hear Neil Jordan's doing another vampire film, your mind kind of goes, what? It's like getting the band back together. This is the best thing ever. So and then it had opened and I missed it. And I wonder if it's around the time I was moving to the UK, but it had opened and I had missed it. And so when I did catch it, I initially didn't really know what to make of it because it was very different tonally. Initially, I thought in the first watch, it's very different. It's got this seaside kind of a little bit of Blackpool mixed in with a little bit of Brighton kind of visual culture. It has a very young Saoirse Ronan, who I'd only really heard about through Atonement before that. So I was like, okay. It had an interesting cast, recognisable people, but again, it had just this hodgepodge of slightly different, maybe slightly grittier material than you have with in comparison with the polished veneer of Interview with the Vampire. So I was thinking, okay, this is quite different. But when I started to get into the kind of guts of the story, I kind of went, oh, that's incredibly Neil Jordan. That's it's very much in his sort of style and oeuvre. You could really see that. Then I started to dig around, obviously looking around it and stuff, and I discovered it was actually based on a play. And a play I have not seen, I must admit. I've read around, but I haven't seen it. And I kind of realized, oh, this is actually exactly what Neil Jordan does. He takes stories, recuperates them in various ways, adapts them to the screen, and brings his own flavor around authorial voice. So it made complete sense that I had, through this process of rediscovery as an audience member, it had become this absolutely quintessential Neil Jordan text.
So what about it feels very Neil Jordan for you?
For me, it's all about telling stories. He's so interested in recuperating a person's perspective or subjectivity. Now, obviously, that's in the DNA of this story. In the case of the play as well, and it's obviously in the case of Interview with the Vampire. But in his stories, you're always getting voices that are just in some ways either snuffed out or bullied out of the public view. And you see this in his non-horror texts as well, like the Brave one, for instance. And he's interested in telling points of view that are difficult sometimes to hear and to take power and to bring it to account. I think that's what he's really interested in doing. So he's always making the powerful accountable for their actions, because their actions are always inevitably in some way trampling on people underfoot. And in this case, he's foregrounding women. And I think that that's something that in Interview with the Vampire we get a very interesting side story of that, of course. But in this film, it feels like a companion piece. The more you watch it, the more you feel it is a kind of an Anglo-Irish companion piece to Into the Vampire's European American male story. So it's I thought it worked very well from that perspective. But Jordan, he uses the visual sumptuousness that you expect of vampirism. He certainly brings in his visual identity around representations of Ireland, Irish mysticism, Irish folklore. And this really enables him to show off all the kind of best parts of his creative flourish for vampirism. So vampirism is very, very rich always when he deals with it. He deals with it in a very exciting, gorgeous way.
Let's talk a little bit about the vampiric duo at the heart of it. So we've got Clara, who is the matriarchal vampire. She's the mother. She's a creator, played by Gemma Arterton, and Saoirse Ronan, her daughter Eleanor, who is also, like you were mentioning before, the voice that is guiding the story and telling their story, not just her own, but also trying to grasp the backstory and the motivations of her mother. What did you make of them as our leads and as vampires as well?
It's great because they really represent different perspectives of female vampirism, or representations of female vampirism. I mean, looking at Clara, for example, she's someone who has most certainly seen the exploitation of her gender and has survived really horrific sort of brushes with patriarchal violence. And she's using it for to serve a very strong impulse of revenge, and to take that sense of disempowerment and to reverse it back onto those who have caused her pain. So you can see that there's this sense of vengeance and fury that drives her. Whereas we see with Eleanor, the more sort of sympathetic character, in the sense that she is doing exactly what those Jordan texts do. She's writing her story and then she tears it up and throws it to the wind, and she's trying to tell it. And in the telling, it becomes a form of infection. It becomes a way to spread out the word, because once she does eventually successfully tell her story to someone who doesn't die straight away, we see that it takes hold and it starts to have consequences and it starts to spread, and it actually puts them in danger. And this is exactly what happens to Into the Vampire when you think of it. It opens and closes with a confession. It is a closed loop, but all of these people along the way get affected by the fact of telling the story, revealing the fact that you're an immortal. I suppose there's no fun in being an immortal if you can't kind of say it to somebody. But it is something very powerful in the case of Eleanor, because the frustration of trying to tell the story and the consequences of it means that she is constantly caught in this loop where she never fully gets that catharsis. So I think the two of them work really, really well together, because they have that mother-daughter relationship that you have seen in other films with Saoirse Ronan, and especially Lady Bird. But you do find that she has this kind of maturity behind these really innocent eyes, and it works very well to kind of pair her up with Gemma Arterton's really fiery, sometimes grating, sometimes necessarily salty performance. I think it works very, very well.
Yeah, I really love the way that they couldn't really seem to find a common language, even though they were sharing this immortal life. And, the mother-daughter bond, which gets a lot more elaborated on and is complicated in the film because of the situation in which Clara gave birth, or, became pregnant with Eleanor and gave birth to her, and then how she tried and perhaps failed to protect her at certain points, but also then made her into a vampire. There's always a sense of both wanting to protect her and wanting to own her and keep her as a child forever, and to keep her as a companion more than have a sense of responsibility for her daughter. I found I genuinely did not remember kind of the complicated dynamics that unfold between them, and it's one of the things that really struck me, that is kind of an underlying layer of depth to the relationship between them.
Yeah, at times they feel like they're sisters. At times they feel, yes, their mother-daughter relationship. At other times she feels like sort of a wayward aunt to Eleanor. I think Eleanor is more stable in that relationship, but she's, because of her sort of youth and her questioning of everything that's going on around her. But I do think that there is this kind of real interesting dynamic interplay between them. It's not a simple question of, you see this in so many narrative films where, someone is cast as the father to a son and you just see it's a very flat relationship. No, this is what female relationships are. They are interesting and fiery and renegotiate power and authority, and at the same time deeply affectionate and loyal. So you can see exactly why their interplay, and sometimes their very subtle relationship with one another, especially in some scenes, it's very subtle. You do see that it drives the story forward. It's a story that's really mostly interested in women, and with men very much as the supporting cast.
Which is interesting because even in the mythology, or the vampire mythology of the film, we're told very explicitly by the male characters of the vampire society that women are not allowed to be turned, and definitely not allowed to quote unquote procreate, I think is the word that they use. So what did you make of the world of vampires as it's built in this film?
Yeah, the Brethren are an interesting sort, aren't they? I mean, what struck me straight away, I'm going to slightly fangirl here for a second, was the shot where you really get this moment really brought home, or indeed emphasized, is when you see Clara discussing her acquisition of knowledge with the Brethren, and it's shot in the Long Room in Trinity College Dublin, yes, where I did my PhD in vampires. So I was sitting there rather enjoying this, as this sort of moment, because the one thing about the Long Room is no matter where you put your camera in the Long Room, it looks amazing. And it's got that smell of knowledge that you get, that leather bound book smell, that ancient smell. And what I loved in that sequence, that very short sequence, but it's a really important one in the film, is that her incongruity, her sense of being a woman, her dress, the way she holds her body, the way she's observed by these males in very austere sort of dress in this world of the written word. She stands out as different because she has stolen the fire of knowledge. And I found that to be just such a brilliantly simple but really effective way of explaining women have always had to fight for their peace, for their access to the same privileges that patriarchal men have had. And in this Vampire Brethren is somewhere between a kind of a covenant of a priesthood. So sort of, a sense of vows to have a scholarly understanding of knowledge, but, do not engage with women beyond transactionary kind of experience. And at the same time, they don't understand women. And that's why they shun them entirely. So Clara's sort of sense of fair game, as in, I'm going to steal it for myself, I have to protect myself and my child. You do get that feeling then that you're on her side, and it's only a question of seeing it as a sort of a source of vampirism as a feminist, holds the keys to the kingdom, I suppose, in terms of feminist liberation for her. So she uses it that way because it's kind of rotting on the vine, all this immortal possibility. It's rotting on the vine with these patriarchal vampire leaders because they're not really doing anything with that ability.
Yes. There's also this element, I think there's an added layer of rejection of her on their part, because not only is she a woman, but she's also a sex worker. Yeah. And, that's not obviously the way that they refer to her in the film, but it's also, I think there's an underlying classist thing where they not only see her as beneath them because she is a woman, they see her as even below where they see women because she is a sex worker. Yeah. And she is throughout the whole film, and I think this makes her so interesting, is that she is not just a survivor, but she is a hustler. She will see opportunities and she will seize them. And I was wondering kind of what do you think of her in this vein, of this idea of a woman who chose this forbidden knowledge and this, eternal life that she never really quite understood, but she instinctively could see that it was a solution for her, a lot of her issues. She would get power, she would get strength, she would survive because she was ill at that point, about to die.
Yeah, so she's the scene I'm thinking of is where she's observing the males, the male vampires. They're in having a bit of a party at the brothel, and she overhears them talk about this gift, and so she steals access to the secret and goes to the island. But in so doing, I think she sees it as two things. She sees it as, I'm stealing the opportunity to, to give myself some sense of freedom. But I think she also does it as well to just, it's like the hustle. It's the extent of the hustle. It's like, well, he was stupid enough to fall asleep. He was stupid enough to get drunk. I'm off. And what does she have to lose? That's the other thing as well. I mean, if you disenfranchise any group or any person to the point where they are literally left fighting for themselves, they are going to get to a point where they're going to say, I've nothing left to lose here, so I'm going to literally go for glory. And that's what she does. What's great about it, though, is that the expression of her transformation, when we see that she is transformed, is so powerfully feminine. It's so this power that the brethren seem to secret for hundreds of years. It's actually a really powerful feminine power, because that transformation of the landscape in particular is it's one of the most striking images in the whole film when we see this space. So, and the fact that it shows that it should be liberated and free, this access to power that vampirism confers, and shouldn't be in the realm of dusty old blokes.
And what do you make of the way that actually the transformation and the powers of a vampire are presented in the film? Because they're probably unlike a lot of what we through pop culture and through horror cinema understand to be, the checkpoints of becoming and being a vampire.
I suppose the thing I liked about it was that it did something very different. It did something very, maybe I'm wrong in saying this in terms of mythology, but it made me think of something awfully Celtic, because there is that transformation of the islands as a sacred sort of space in Irish culture. So you have islands that hold ancient secrets to, if you think back, and I'm sorry to kind of go to a different series for a second, but if you look at something like the opening of Star Wars, if you look at The Force Awakens and even the later films, they all return to that sense of the islands off Kerry. And they do this because that's places where we've actually got, ancient monasteries and relics from, thousands of years. And it shows that there's a sense of time in a capsule that you get with these island spaces. So it made complete sense to me that, and you have that with the Blaskets as well off Ireland. So it made sense to me that Neil Jordan, who hails from Sligo, again, with a very ragged coastline, lots of islands, he would have this same emotional connection to the idea of the landscape as something that's both completely captivated and captured in time, but also expresses change for better or worse in a very visually, almost sumptuously over imaginative way, by having the waters literally turn blood red when someone is transformed. I love the fact it goes back to that idea of nature, the idea of birds literally enveloping the person to be transformed. I find that very powerful, because in some ways, when we think of vampirism and transformation, we think back to Anne Rice, we think back to Dracula, the bites, the penetration, all that stuff. What if it's actually something really secretive within nature itself, that you have to kind of you have to seek it out and discover it? It's almost like a Grail narrative. You have to encounter it in order to then reap the benefit of it. I think there's something very ancient about that, and very, very seductive.
Absolutely. It almost feels like becoming a vampire. Well, there's two things that really struck me. Becoming a vampire seems to be almost an endurance test, both physical and spiritual and emotional. You have to climb up that mountain. You have to, uncover, or, in the case of Clara, steal the secret knowledge of how to get there, go through all of these tests and face what they call in the film the nameless saint. But also, interestingly, it's probably one of the very few films that I've seen where becoming a vampire does not involve anyone else. It's entirely a solitary experience, and in fact, kind of by design.
A spiritual one, I would argue, as well, because it's only something, it can't be, the information can be given to you, but you still have to have the courage to go in. You still have the courage to go through with whatever test you feel you're going to face when you walk into the cave. And I thought that was great because it meant that you don't have then the bickering and the anger that you get in something like Interview with the Vampire, where it's like, you made me because you felt guilty, or because you feel obligated to me, or you made me a vampire because you have nobody else. There's none of that. I mean, there's little echoes of that, but there's nothing in comparison to the sort of guilt that you get out of the Interview with the Vampire. So I thought it was much more empowering in that sense.
And what did you make of the actual, the day-to-day of the vampires of Byzantium, of their hunt, of the way that they kill, and kind of how those stereotypes, I guess, or those tropes, more, that's a better word, how those tropes of what being a vampire is like apply in this film?
Well, I loved, there was extensions, there was different things that I saw in other Jordan films that worked in this as well. And one of the things that struck me was that, of course, they don't have the fangs. So that's a really interesting, it's a way to kind of make it play out so that it has its own organic sense of puncturing bodies, but it doesn't have to always be about sex. Sex is almost transactional in the film. I always felt that it was very much it's very much a thing you have to do to make money. It wasn't really intimate. Intimacy was conveyed in very different emotional ways, I thought. But I'm thinking of Eleanor in particular, with her really fascinating thumbnail. I really love that thumbnail because, of course, it immediately made me think, as was put in the book, it really made me think again of Interview with the Vampire with Lestat, who has this lovely silver thimble.
Yes.
And he scrapes it across the face of the young fop at the beginning of the film. And it made me think of that straight away when I watched Byzantium. I went, oh my God, okay. So for men, it's performative, and for women, it's organic. That's the first thing I kind of thought of, that the impulse to kill, or this way to survive, I suppose. So I love that about Eleanor. Funny fact, when they were shooting Byzantium in Dublin, I actually was teaching in UCD at the time, and they were using the arts block of UCD to for the hospital scenes where she kills with the with her lovely thumbnail in this kind of hospital sequence. So yeah, that was kind of interesting, because I did remember hearing Neil Jordan's making a movie about vampires. I'm like, in UCD, and then I kind of realized why. If you know UCD, it's a very 60s campus, very modernist. It looks kind of like UEA. So I kind of thought that's a very strange choice for a vampire film, but there you go. So it doubles as the hospital in the film. But I just think that, with the vampiric transformation, it's all about the key transactionary thing in this is not really blood, it's knowledge. Knowledge is a dangerous thing. She's told knowledge is dangerous, and those who have the knowledge must be killed. So this is something that I found really has taken center stage in so many vampire films the last 20 odd years, which is that knowledge of vampires is dangerous, but then not only that, but how you get the knowledge and how you pass it on. That's really where the power of this is. So I think yes, it stands in for feminism. Yes, it stands in for sort of empowerment beyond sexuality, or breaking out of that mold that women are only really represented as vice or as saints. But it works beyond that as well, to say that women are complex, women have their own needs, women have their own relationships that men cannot control. And this is why they confound male societies like the Brethren, because you can't make people conform to your rules when they don't understand you.
And on that note, female vampires have always had a presence in horror films, and particularly in the 70s, where lesbian vampires were kind of the trend du jour in horror cinema and in softcore cinema as well. But this film, I find, seems to have kind of fallen through the cracks sometimes in conversations around female vampires on screen. So how do you think it updates or as you said before, kind of foregrounds female vampires in a way that seems quite unique, but also responds to a lot of the conventions of what we might have seen before? So,
well, I'm doing my best to recuperate this one, because I'm actually working on something on Neil Jordan cinema as well. Ooh. So with Byzantium. So I think what he's doing is, it's very clever film. When you peel away the sort of surface material, you kind of see, on one level, yes, it's about female vampirism, empowerment, emancipation, absolutely. But what it's also doing is it's taking the issues around class that you see in something when you go as far back as John Polidori's story, The Vampire from 1819. You see the same sort of you see the same contestation of knowledge and class and power. The women are taking that from the male patriarchal role that we see and using it for their own freedom, for their own emancipation, but that also comes at a price of not to be tamed. So what it's doing is it is taking the dichotomy of women as either virgin or as vice and complicating it and showing that women are, for various reasons, just as frustrated and emotionally angry and at the same time subjectively important as any other male vampire in fiction. I think the fact that we have, we have these softcore vampires and hammer vampires with their incredible décolletages. We have all of this. But I think that's always it's always in service to the male audience. It's always in service to a sexualized gaze. And I think that this film denies you that. It doesn't give you that with the female vampires at all. If anything, the female vampires are basically gaining revenge, as you would expect, but at the same time they're also rescuing and recuperating people who have also suffered in various ways. What I really like about the film is that it foregrounds the idea of birthdays as something that are quite tragic. Birthdays are something that document time passing, and if you're a vampire, it doesn't really matter, but if you're human, it's one more year of documenting either suffering or the lack of celebration. There's an interesting sort of noting of the passing of time through birthdays in that film, I found. So I think it shows that women are whole and beautiful and seductive and complex, and that's something that you don't always get in other vampire cinema around female bodies.
That's such a beautiful statement, Circa. Thank you. And I was wondering if before we move on to Jim Jarmusch's film, is there anything that we haven't touched upon on Byzantium that you really wanted to talk about?
No, except to say that Johnny Lee Miller is fantastic as a villain, I found in this. I thought he was really enjoying every moment of it as Lord Ruffin. It's a really, really, as you say, it's an perhaps slightly underappreciated film. I think it's worth a couple of views. I don't think it necessarily reveals all of its gems on the first viewing, but it is very strikingly beautiful. And I think with more watches, you start to see and understand how it very much is a quintessential Neil Jordan film as well.
And on that note, let's move on to Only Lovers Left Alive from 2013.
"1868, our third wedding. You look so young."
Give my regards to that suicidally romantic scoundrel.
Well, let's hope he's just romantic.
You being so reclusive and everything is probably only going to make people more interested in your music.
Yeah. What a drag.
My sister's looking for us.
Shouldn't she be sleeping in a coffin somewhere?
I'm really, really hungry.
Could you smell it all the way from LA?
We're gonna have so much fun together.
We gotta go. Right now.
Is that the really good stuff?
Precisely.
Typo. Negativo.
I protect a secret in your soul.
How can you have lived for so long and still not get it? You've been pretty lucky in love, though, if I may say so.
I have what you need.
Not what I need.
So with this film, kind of the same question. What is your relationship with Jim Jarmusch's vampire film?
This was a funny one for me. This was complex. I do remember going to see it and thinking to myself, it's very stylish. It's very pretty. Yeah, this is kind of, if I could be a vampire today, this is exactly what I think I'd like to get up to. But I did on the first viewing kind of think, well, what does it really have to say? What does it really have to... Is it simply that vampirism is sort of a form of creativity? And then I kind of sat on it for a while and I kind of gestated over it for a bit. And then when I came back, I kind of thought, actually, on rewatch, it stood up far better. I felt that I was less frustrated with the aesthetics, because the aesthetics are beautiful, but I wanted some substance as well. But then I started to see that actually it was an interesting counterpoint to other vampire films going on, or vampire TV series at that time. It was showing that vampirism is great, but you know, it's like sort of the artist's life. You know, it is a beautiful thing. It's a great thing to aim for, but you do kind of wonder, how do they cope with the boredom of it? How do they cope with the passing of time? Vampires in this are sort of, in some ways, they're almost angelic in the sense that they have these beautiful creative impulses that, you know, they bestow upon the human world. The human world seems to be much less creative than the vampiric world. That sounds great. You could spend the entirety of your time on Earth reading books, making music, you know, having scientific breakthroughs. All these things are really exciting. But I kind of felt that, you know, yeah, I get the ennui, I get the tiredness of it. Creativity without sort of reception and a little bit of, you know, frisson, that doesn't really do much if you're just creating in a vacuum. And this is exactly where we find Adam, Tom Hiddleston's very, I must admit, very vampirically beautiful on screen, tragic male vampire who is whiling away his time in a very sort of desolate and drained Detroit. I found that to be quite a fitting, apt metaphor. So there's kind of the eternal issues of the soul, and then there's the physical spaces of these post-industrialist wastelands that we find our vampires are still inhabiting. You know,
I mean, I definitely want to talk about the spaces because I also found it so interesting. But if I can, I just remembered this was actually the first film that I saw when I moved to London this time round. It was the first film that I saw in a cinema at the Rio Cinema in Dalston before I even moved to the area. If you've never been to the cinema, or if someone's never been to the cinema, it's like it's an independent cinema here in Dalston. It's very Art Deco. It's very campy, slightly dingy, but very beautiful, very ornate. The screen itself, so it felt like the most perfect environment to watch this film, which also feels like slightly over the top, very ornate, very beautiful. And I had not rewatched this film since then. And when I rewatched it for the purposes of this, and I have it on Blu-ray in my house, I just had never gone back to it. It felt so interesting to watch it in the context of having spent a year basically in lockdown.
Yes.
And, you know, they do have the option to go outside and they socialize and all of that. So it's not strictly the same, but a big chunk of the film is spent, especially the time that we spent with Adam and a little bit of what we see of Eve and Tangier before they meet, is essentially spent in isolation, surrounded by things and surrounded by things to entertain them, which sometimes work, sometimes don't. And it's the surrounding themselves with gadgets and with culture, books, records. You know, they don't really have films that much in Only Lovers Left Alive. But I suddenly felt, I was like, oh, holy shit. This has been literally, I'm just seeing my own lockdown experience reflected through a film from 2013 as just living in an apartment surrounded by increasingly taller piles of books. And
I'm liking that. That makes, because it's making me think now, of course, my other half is obsessed with music because he used to work in music production. And I'm obviously always surrounded by books, and I'm just thinking, oh wow, maybe that's us then. I didn't realize that projection of it. You know, I'm always surrounded by piles and stacks of books, just like herself. So in a way, that's kind of a nice parallel. I must say that.
And listening to you speak as well about kind of how beautiful they are and how much they luxuriate in the art of creation and in culture and in these cultural objects. I was suddenly thinking, hearing you speak, that there is a very distinct privilege that they have in this film that I haven't really seen in other vampire films that don't center so much on the boredom. You know, they center a lot on the kind of the ennui, the moral conundrum of I must kill to survive, but I will live forever and I will be forever beautiful and I have all of these perks of being a vampire, but it comes at a cost. And here, you know, we'll get into the blood stuff later, but there's the privilege of time for them to be able to create. It's not necessarily that they're more talented than any of the humans that they're assisting in the creation of culture. It's also the fact that they actually do not have to worry about the things that consume humans for so long.
Yes.
So they have this, you know, unearthly privilege of time where they can literally just lounge around and make art and play chess and think about things.
Yeah, they also do run on a very on a different timeline as such. I mean, for them, it is more luxurious. There is more of the sense of waiting. It's a rejection of the instantaneous culture. It's very much about thinking it through and debating and that moral philosophizing, the armchair philosophy that we all used to enjoy in the pre-internet age, and now we just Google stuff. But, you know, there was a sense of there's a luxury with time. And I really think that the film enjoys reminding you of that with its very incredibly with its things like its swirly camera work. It's got these lovely tilts and rotations that you see. It's cosmic on one level. It's about kind of pondering the universe and pondering your place within it and the rotation of time. It really, that kind of struck me in the opening scene in particular. So we get this sense of there's a cyclical nature to all of it. You know, people come and go, the humans live and die, and yet these people are almost frozen in time. They talk about issues that have happened 400 or 500 years ago as though it was last week. So they have this long sense of memory. But I also think as well as that, they feel that they've been through this before and they will survive it and become reinvigorated and move on. You get this sense that they're just in that lapse phase of, oh, I'm a bit tired and a bit jaded from all of this kind of cultural creation and this worry that I have about the contemporary world, but I know that chances are we'll be fine. So there is this sense of survival that kicks in as well. I mean, I don't feel I'm selling this film very well because I actually do really like it. I really think it's very visually interesting, but I do find that their sense of just frustration and I suppose the tiredness we can all relate to, where we're like, I'm just going to keep going and see what happens. They're going through this with the sense of the vampire condition. They have lost, at least temporarily, they've lost that spark of what makes it really great to be a vampire. You know, because they do grapple with concepts around suicide and about ending it all. And sometimes that's sort of out of that self-parody of the great creator who can no longer burden his genius and must kill himself. But I think as well there's also a sense of if we're creating this material and nobody else can really truly appreciate it or understand it, then why am I burdened with this creation? And I think that that's the stress and the frustration we have in our central couple. So I've mostly spoken about Adam, Tom Hiddleston's character, but equally Eve, the always ethereally amazing Tilda Swinton. She
a goddess in our midst.
Yeah, she really is. She really is. I mean, she's a stunner in every sense, and I mean, ridiculously talented. She is so insightful and alive, funnily enough, paradoxically perhaps, in playing this vampire. She really captures that sense of the excitement of understanding creativity and understanding great thinkers and great philosophy and discussing books and the things that make people like you and I terribly excited. But she does it in a way where we kind of feel that she is the only hope for this to have any sense of it mattering, because in the hands of the creative destructive artist like Adam, it's only a matter of time before he will expire from this earth one way or the other. She's the one who's sort of sense and reason and control and logic and emotional sort of clarity. I felt that she was the rock of reason in this film in many respects.
Absolutely. And also a sense of one of the things that I found very beautifully expressed visually is her sense of creative curiosity and not feeling burdened by it or creating additional steps for herself in the way that I think it's very expressed with technology, but also very in a slightly comedic way. The way that Adam is always tinkering with analog versions for things that could be made so much simpler. The fact that he connects his phone camera through like 3 different devices onto his very old 1950s TV while she's just looking through her iPhone. It's just very, very, very funny visual language. But what mostly struck me about Eve was the fact that she is so happy to have, she seems so genuinely thrilled and constantly curious to have all of this time to luxuriate in all the objects and the art that she loves. And I love the scene where she's packing to go visit Adam, and there is a whole montage of her deciding and just touching the books, and it's books in different languages. I mean, obviously, you know, in the same way as I think that there's no straight vampire, because it's just incongruous to me. The idea that vampires could only speak one language also seems bizarre, but this is probably one of the few visual ways that I've seen representative of a vampire kind of not genuinely loving something that's not a person, that's just culture, and these objects that clearly mean so much to her, and they're books.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm trying to think right now. I can't really think off the top of my mind of any other vampire films straight away where they're not, if they're obsessed with an object, it's usually an object that extends their power or does something around their immortality, or it is attached to a person. So yeah, the idea that she's sitting there literally loving the books the way you would feel any academic would, or indeed any sort of, you know, just bibliophile would, in the sense that they are companions on your journey. You know, they're much more than just, you know, ink and paper. I think that's really, it's very romantic. But as I say, and I feel that, again, linking it back to Byzantium, in a sense that, you know, you feel that there's something very seductive about the ability to pass on knowledge through the written word for thousands of years. It's kind of like folklore. It's kind of like vampirism. It passes on and extends through. So we can see why you'd have it protected in the image that we got from Byzantium with the long room hub and how it's guarded as a secret. But then in her case, it's everywhere. It's all around us. She's, I mean, I'm thinking of the images in particular where Jarmusch's camera is really interested in situating Eve in her space, and she's piles of books just everywhere. They're just absolutely everywhere. It's kind of like I almost can't get enough. There's so much knowledge in the world, and I can't possibly consume it all. And that's I get that. I kind of feel like that the first day of annual leave. It's like, oh my god, there's so much I can't wait to read.
You know what? On a purely personal level, as I was rewatching this film last night, I was looking at it's like, you know what? If I was turned into a vampire tonight, this is exactly what I would be doing. I'd just be lounging around on my 4-story bed. And
in my fabulous Tangiers home, yes, reading every book I can get my hand on.
Also, just in my Dalston flat, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to fill this up with even more books, because now time is not an issue.
Well, that's true. If you don't feel time is an issue, or indeed that you have to earn a living, in the sense that you don't have to go out and work to pay bills, if you feel that you can luxuriate in this, I think we'd all, in some way, give in to those immediate impulses to listen to loads of music, create something, write something. Yeah, I think so.
And on that note, actually, what do you think about the way that this film kind of builds such a massive cultural tapestry? Because there's a lot of both visual and named references to musicians, to artists, to filmmakers, to writers. Kind of, it feels, I read in a review somewhere that it feels like a very curated film.
Yeah, it reminded me, funnily enough, of a novel called I, Vampire by Michael Romke, where in this novel, it's very similar in the sense we have a normal character, or everyday human character, who is brought into this world of vampires. And the vampire world is all full of celebrities. So you've got Mozart, you've got Shakespeare, you've got, you know, all of these figures throughout history. You've got Dostoevsky, and, you know, And then a couple of really interesting villains as well from history too.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing about it was that you kind of thought it's a world of privilege. And I mean, really, really powerful privilege, because this is the privilege of being, as I say, blessed with this vision of creation and curiosity. What I liked about this was that it seems like Jarmusch is creating his own personal idealized version of these spaces and texts and artifacts that he seems to really have an appreciation for. That it's a very personalized vision of these kind of comments around music and literature. I mean, not so much film, I must admit, but there are a couple of moments, but nothing that particularly stands out in comparison with the fascination with music. And then I suppose even thinking about the idea about vinyl and old technology, you know, old technology comes back in vogue in different ways. So it is about the idea of the fire that it lights in our imagination. Even older technology, it does become something that becomes fetishized as well. I'm thinking of like how LPs came back into fashion as well, and they have a richness of sound that you can't seem to replicate in any other technological medium. So I think that's really interesting, that we kind of, vampires are their own, they are stuck in their own time, but they endure. There's something unique about them in that sense.
And there's also this idea throughout the film of vampires, or maybe particularly just these three vampires that were actually the creators of a lot of our greatest cultural moments. And I want to talk a little bit about the character of Christopher Marlowe, who's played here by John Hurt, who, you know, John Hurt, even in this film kind of taps into that conspiracy theory. I guess conspiracy theory is not really the appropriate way of calling something that has a lot of academic study behind it. That Marlowe was actually the person who wrote a lot, if not all, of Shakespeare's work. And here the film pretty much like says that. And also Eve and Adam are, you know, they're presented as the actual creative forces behind a lot of human achievement. So I guess my question is kind of, how do you feel about real life culture intersecting with this vampire world, specifically through Christopher Marlowe?
I think I laughed when the first time I heard of it. Yeah, of course, because again, it goes back to that example I gave about Romke. You know, the idea of the best and the brightest among us, or the most ambitious, or the most creatively charged, like Michelangelo, etc. Of course, they're vampires because they are the pinnacle of human achievement, or the literature that they produce is so inspired it could only have been brought upon by the influence of angels or devils. So yeah, I can understand that. Of course, that again, it forms that lovely elite group that I suppose if any of us could be part of something like that, we would be so. We would be surrounded by so much genius. You know, we love seeing this in human culture, where there's sort of the inner sanctum of people who are in on maybe the conspiracy theory, but equally maybe the room where it happens, the power or the influence and the control. I think someone like Marlowe, he plays with that. He makes it quite amusing. Yes, of course, you know, okay, I wrote those plays, I gave him a hand. I think it's interesting though that even though they bestow these gifts, if you will, cultural gifts on humanity, they still remove themselves from humanity. So it's like literally a sort of a version of manna from heaven. It's kind of like it's a sprinkling of fairy dust to say, I'm sharing this gift with you, do with it what you will. And how humankind takes it up and how it sustains itself through human culture afterwards. It's kind of like the legacy of any kind of creative endeavor. How it comes to pass in human culture depends on who's doing the reading and who's thinking about it 300 or 400 years from now. So I think with Marlowe, it's funny and it's sad as well. I always find that it's quite a sad film to watch because it's one of John Hurt's last films as well. But the fact that he's such there's something so roguish about him in this. There's something so delightfully inspiring about it that it makes you think, yeah, the creative ones are amongst us. They are the ones who look like they would be sitting around strange cafes in Tangier. Yeah, that's exactly where you'd find Marlowe. He wouldn't be locked up in the British Library or anything like that. So there is a sort of a what would you call it? It's kind of like that cultural kind of wandering emotion, never fully creatively fulfilled kind of character. I do find that he's like that. But the fact that he and Eve have such a lovely paternalistic relationship, I find that, I mean, yes, it is more, I suppose it's not fully paternalistic, but it is emotionally kind of conceived of in that way in the framing. I do think that there is something transformative in their relationship, because once he passes, she really gets that urge to then find her joie de vivre. I mean, in the sense of survival, not just creative consumption, but survival. That really gets knocked forward, of course, once he passes away in the film.
And we haven't really spoken about the way that the visual language of vampirism in this film. And I remember it vaguely, but I found it very distinctly the visual language of how addiction is also portrayed in cinema, very specifically kind of heroin. So I was wondering kind of what your thoughts were on how the reality, the blood rituals of being a vampire are presented in the film.
Well, what struck me straight away was the reaction of, yes, there's discussion of purity and stuff, which again, of course, make you think of heroin or something like that, that you'd require a huge amount of sort of, the purer it is, the more amazing it is, or the more likely it is to sustain you. I love the, and that ties in again with the image that we again see of Adam. He has that sort of wasted away genius rock star look going on that does make you, of course, think of heroin. But there is also, again, that craving that you find where they're trying to be ethical. I always thought that was an interesting thing. They're trying to be ethical consumers of blood, sourcing clean blood, fine, that's grand. You can see why in the contemporary context, and especially in terms of a drug context. But I did think that there was something interesting about there's something very humane about that. Like, they don't want to have to kill. They will if they have to, but they don't want to. There's a sense of being, again, having a sort of a liberal left ethical purpose, I suppose. Trying not to be part so much of the drug trade, or not trying to infect others, but rather just to procure what you need. It's interesting then when, of course, Eve's sister comes into the picture, because, of course, she ruins everything, and she helps explode out this problem, and that enables them to break out of their comfort zones and actually have to deal with the problem. So I like the fact that, though, there's moments in it, I think particularly with Eve, when she kind of stares longingly, or indeed, kind of she gets that really interesting sort of twitchy upper lip that you just go, right, that there is a craving there that never fully dies, which of course fits perfectly into the vampire narrative. What about yourself? You definitely said you picked up something quite specific on the heroin image there.
Totally. In fact, I think in the first scenes, when even the overhead shots, the way that they're filmed of that high, and every time they consume blood, I think it's filmed very, very distinctly as a drug high. And it really reminded me almost of particular images from Trainspotting, I guess, because that's one of the most iconic portrayals of heroin addiction. But obviously this is a type of addiction that has no consequences. They never, even though they're addicts, they do actually need it to survive, and there is no way of fixing it. There is just control. But even all of their day to day is entirely marked by kind of the images of what we think kind of addicts would behave like, or what we've seen in movies. They chat. Obviously, they're incredibly well-read, incredibly well-traveled and smart, but it's that armchair philosophy that you were referencing before. It's kind of aimless chat. It's not productive, quote unquote. It's not creating anything. It's just chit-chat. And then they get high, they enjoy the high, and they sort of fall asleep, and they're beautiful and languid and stuff. But if you strip away the supernatural elements, the vampirism, the imagery, I think, is almost exactly the same as in any kind of drug romance film. I think a lot about, it really reminded me of this film with Heath Ledger and Abby Cornish. It's an Australian film. It's a film from 2006 called Candy. And it's essentially about a drug addicted couple, right? But a lot of the film is spent on the kind of the honeymoon phase of their addiction, where it does feel like a heightened version of reality. And it's very sunshiny, it's very free-flowing, and it's very kind of romantic in a way, but the underlying knowledge is that it's manufactured because it's all in the high. And in the same way here, kind of it's tapping into images that we're really familiar with, but obviously we're kind of taking away all the darkness from it in a way, because they're supernatural creatures, so the rules of addiction kind of don't apply to them in the same way.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, again, the idea of the ethically sourcing of it as well. You're not polluting your outer realm, the community or whatever. You're not bringing social problems in with it. It seems to be something that is very clinical and very procured in a very isolated sense. So I think that, from the social dynamic aspect of it, it's kind of like what we imagine Jim Morrison was doing in the late 1960s. I'm writing songs, I'm getting high, and I'm a poet, and I'm changing the world. And that might seem naive, but another way you kind of go, it's a deeply romantic way to live. It's the artist's dream in that sense. So I can see why it's both very enticing, but it's also, it needs the cloak of vampirism in a way to show up its falsity, to show up that it's really not in the gift of human existence to just do this, because we don't have limitless time. So we need, as you said yourself, there's unproductive chat. Yeah, of course there is. But that's the I think part of the human drive is to, in some ways, however you quantify it, to be productive, because you want to be able to say, in whatever you do, I was here and I mattered. And this is why we have cave paintings. People have done this to say, I was here and I mattered. But, these vampires don't have to worry about that. They are here. They endure. They still matter, at least in the way that they consume and bring forward the knowledge of the past into the contemporary moment. And this is, I think, one of the interesting things that Marlowe is struggling with in the film. This is what he's struggling with, is this idea of it just continues on, and I do think there's a point, though, and this is something that Rice has in her series as well, is that vampires, they come to a point when they just go, unending life is unbearable, because it's kind of like too much pleasure and too much pain. You need the diversity in order to have a fully rounded existence. And I think that you really don't know the sweetness of pleasure if you don't know the sourness of pain. So it is something to do with that balance. And they are, even visually on screen, they are always representing this kind of interesting balance. She in white, he in black, quite literally yin and yang on screen. The way that they're filmed in those hazy moments that you described, they do look like yin and yang, especially when there's 360 sort of shots of them from above that make you think like, wow, they do look like they're sort of in this encircling of time. It has that cosmic relevance. So I think it's there. I think everything that we've discussed is in the DNA of it.
Totally.
How the film has a lasting impact in terms of the way it represents vampirism, sort of partially kind of a self-indulgent idea around creative knowledge and power, partially to boredom, also to beauty and ethereal sort of complexity. I don't know. I think in some ways it's going to be seen as a beautiful piece of arthouse cinema that has a fantastic cast, but at the same time, I don't know about its lasting impact. I say that really because I don't know how. Does it feel like it's had its moment? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I feel like, if anything, and as I mentioned before, it feels more impactful watching it after having spent a year in lockdown.
Yeah, okay.
and having been essentially, well, a lot of us been forced to be by ourselves in isolation and also contemplate a lot of these things. And one thing that I kind of picked up from this film, and kind of not to, go back to the parallels of addiction, is this idea of they do not suffer the consequences of their actions, which is also something that, the idea of social responsibility and stuff is something we've been really thinking about, or, I hope we've been thinking about through this whole panini. But it's, even when Ava, the sister, Mia Wasikowska's character, when she essentially, quote unquote, ODs on Ian, on Anton Yelchin's character, he's the one who perishes. He's the one
Yes.
who dies. She
Yeah.
is happily kind of, floating around and causes destruction and chaos, but she herself is not affected.
Mhm.
And when Marlowe dies, it's also, arguably because he had a bad batch.
Mhm.
They literally say he had like poisoned blood. But there is a sense of ceremony and of it being a funeral that he is ready to go. So there is
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm just reading too much into it.
No,
I
not
got
at all.
I got a sense that maybe that was he had done it on purpose because he was done. There was nothing else he
Yeah.
wanted to do.
Or that, you're at the point where you kind of go, if this is it, so be it. That there's nothing, I've reached the end of what I feel I can offer. And if this is, we get the Bad Batch story, but again, as you say, it could very well be the case of, well, even if he knew it, would he have done anything any differently? It's funny, it spoke to you in terms of the lockdown piece, but what spoke to me is what was, I suppose, in Byzantium, and it shows what we're kind of thinking about, and that is that I've been dying to get back to Ireland, so I've been looking at Byzantium going, I just want to go back to the island, I want to go back to the magical red island. So for me, that's exactly what it made me think of, that sort of the inability to move out, in that international sense. So it's funny what it's bringing out in us as viewers at this time.
Totally. And kind of I love that you bring up kind of the idea of landscape and stuff, because this film sits really interesting in comparison to Byzantium, because Byzantium is very open, like you mentioned, the landscape and the way that it uses nature, and this Only Lovers After Life is pretty much entirely done in closed rooms, or very, very very industrial landscapes, or in Tangiers in these sort of like corridor like tiny streets. So I was wondering kind of how do you think the locations and the spaces play into the film?
I loved the fact that it was in some ways a very indoors film. The space of Detroit has this sort of really interesting wasteland, this post-industrial, post-capitalist space that has just been drained of all of its vitality or all of its natural life. It's a perfect metaphor for vampirism. Of course a vampire would live there because you endure on, but there's that initial, I suppose that's that which makes you human is gone. You are now a supernatural, I wouldn't say husk, because Tom Hiddleston's not hard on the eyes or anything, but he is definitely
he's no Frank Langella.
But even then, the fact that he's resuscitating the technology that shows you that he's committed to a past, a life of the past, that he's trying to bring up to date, but he can't. Well, he's humorously going to do it, but in a way that Detroit, its best days are behind it. In this film, it sees Detroit as somewhere that is dangerous, is post-industrialist, but also something that is in some ways past its best moments, past its pinnacle. And I think that this is how Adam feels when he's in the film. When he's at the beginning of the film, he feels like he's past that pinnacle moment. Even though he's creating music, he has that idea of creation versus the desire of fame, or indeed the reception of fame. This is something that he struggles with. So do you create something, or do you do it for economic or sort of impactful reasons like that? I think in the case of Eve, it's much more about that European romance of to literally sort of, give in to creation. And I'm thinking of all those those romantic figures in sort of 18th century literature, just that idea of almost like what we imagine Byron's existence was like. You travel and you create and you consume and you have that sense of creativity is your job. I do feel that she's like that in terms of you're meeting great minds, you're discovering new spaces. And in Tangier, it's this gateway between Africa and Europe. And I do feel that, that space is very deliberately sort of looking at the expression and the expansion of vampirism between Europe and Africa, and this cultural exchange. It's like this kind of crossroads of the world. And I thought that was really interesting, because Detroit is post-industrialist, it's past. And hers is sort of looking at the kind of the crossroads of the future, which is between sort of European and Pan-African influence. I thought that was something very interesting in that.
Absolutely. Before we bring in both of the films together, is there any other aspect of Only Lovers After Life that you feel we haven't touched upon that you wanted to talk about?
I was just thinking, one of the things, it was nice to see Anton Yelchin in that. Obviously, he's this and Green Room, I think, is another great film that he was in. You know, he's such a sad talent to have lost, and I think that in terms of the visual aspects of the film, it's such a Jim Jarmusch film, for better or worse. And I think that I think your feelings towards maybe his cinema might indeed help you contextualize how Only Lovers Left Alive works for you. But it is a very artistic, beautiful vampire film, not about death and destruction and sex and power, but rather about creativity, inspiration, how if we really could be vampires, what would we really do with that gift if we didn't want to just pillage and take over countries? So, you know, I think there's something quite nice in the imaginative spaces that it creates on screen.
Yes, it feels almost very down to earth, despite being very ethereal and very domestic in some ways.
It is very domestic. I suppose it is about you and your sweetie just living out eternity, and how do you guys balance each other out, you know, in that way. And in that sense, it's very sweet in a world where so much vampire cinema in particular is all about death and destruction and exploitation and sex and violence. It's the opposite of that. It's very contained and emotionally interesting within a very contained narrative. And I think that's very much expressed in the geography we see on screen. They're all contained spaces. It's not about the vampire's expanse. It's about their internal world reflected in those landscapes.
And to bring both of these films together, they came out fairly around the same time, and Byzantium had, I think, a little bit less of a cultural ripple effect, perhaps. But I was wondering, what do you think, or where do you see the influence of both of these films and the way that they approach vampires, which is, you know, very different as we've been discussing for the past hour. But considering when they came out, do you see any influence from these films on other vampire products?
That's interesting. I mean, I would see them very much as at the time in which they were made, they're responding to different issues around the popularity of the vampire at that time. The vampire story, I mean, you have, you know, when Maura Breffney's play, A Vampire Story, came out in 2008, that was very timely, because in 2008 we had also all the Twilight stuff. We also had the beginning of True Blood. We also had Let the Right One In, and its various remakes to come. So we have all of this kind of vampires are everywhere in the culture at that time. And then the ripple effect out of that, the films and texts that it has produced are very much counter narratives to the stuff that we find in those bigger tales like Twilight and True Blood. That's all about vampires live amongst us, or is alongside us, and we fall in love with them, or whatever. Whereas in Only Lovers Left Alive, it is about that separation. We are in parallel existence, but we don't actually engage with the humans, really. We're living this very privileged parallel life. In Byzantium, it's all about, but are we still dealing with the politics and the dynamics around women having their own autonomy in every sense, and how that is still being questioned. And that's something you find in the texts equally in something like True Blood, or not True Blood, Twilight. You know, we find those issues around female autonomy and power and control. So I think they're talking about things that we have always talked about in relation to vampire cinema, but it's the way that those two films since Byzantium and Only Lovers Left Alive have rippled out. I think it's not as evident to me at the moment, now that I'm thinking of it, as other texts would be. I mean, I suppose you have a little sense of that play with it in something like What We Do in the Shadows, the television series. We do see a little bit of that sort of sense of when they're sitting around their house in Staten Island, there is a sense of lack of production. They don't do very much. But that's kind of the pleasure of it. You know, they're kind of like, it's kind of like sitting around with your mates, not worrying about being productive, because, you know, why would you have to worry about that? So there, and there again, their inability or perhaps lack of desire to be up to date. That's just that's a whole ongoing joke in the vampire world anyway. I think Byzantium, in a way, it's a pity it didn't have the resonance that one would have liked it to have. I think because I think in some ways it could have been just an issue around marketing, that it is a film that combines Anglo-Irish imagery as opposed to sort of the more grandiose American imagery.
Mhm.
And I think that in the marketing that might not necessarily have translated very well. I also think as well that with Only Lovers Left Alive, it has that Jarmusch art house aesthetic that would naturally draw in a crowd interested in what Jarmusch is doing, as opposed to just another vampire story.
Mhm.
Filtered through the director's eyes, it will attract its own sort of audience. But I think Byzantium has been, academically, it has been considered and reconsidered by scholars like myself and other people. We've thought about how it's a companion piece in Jordan cinema, and I think that, you know, time will tell how this has actually worked out. But it's nice to have a female vampire story that does not focus necessarily on spectacularizing the body, but rather actually thinking about, you know, freedom and intellectual freedom, and also freedom of the soul. You know, that they're beyond patriarchal power. So that may be the lasting legacy it has.
Yeah, and I'd love for people to revisit Byzantium a bit more, because I definitely think it deserves a bit more attention. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that the Jarmusch audience, the art house audience, would go and watch this because it's a Jarmusch film, which would go and watch Only Lovers Left Alive because it's a Jarmusch film, and also it has the benefit of being made around the time where Hiddlemania was at its peak, and
Yes.
everybody just wanted to watch Tom Hiddleston do anything. That man could have made, you know, a 3-hour film about him watching a fly on a wall, and people would have bought tickets for it. And obviously Tilda Swinton is a you know, an incredible presence, and also
she's an
has
icon.
and has her own audience. The fact that it's a vampire film almost seemed an excuse.
Secondary.
Yes,
Yeah.
totally secondary.
Yeah.
Whether it's you know, Saoirse Ronan obviously has become much bigger since then, and Gemma Arterton is always also a very recognized actress. But I think that tapping into what people might be interested to see at that time was not really on the side of Byzantium. And because our preconceptions of, you know, I'm trying to excuse why a film did not have the resonance that I thought it should have had in 2012. But, you know, that our idea that you mentioned before of female vampires are supposed to be like this, and that using that to market Byzantium would probably have been a mistake, because it really does not play into that at all. And it goes in a completely different way. And it's, I guess, the expectations of a Neil Jordan vampire film after something as seminal and influential as Into the Vampire would have also been sky high, because I don't think I think it's the same kind of audience, but I can see that the expectations would potentially deceive an audience that was expecting something along the lines of the kind of the gothic sexiness of Interview with a Vampire.
It's not as glossy. I think that's one of the things, because Into the Vampire, one thing it really has going for it is that it is very glossy. And that's not a criticism so much as it is the aesthetic makeup of the film. It is quite beautiful and arresting, and it does have this sort of huge, not only star power, but it also has that huge sense of expectation that came with that film when it came out. So with Byzantium, it felt like something that almost took you by surprise, and then you kind of went, oh, okay. And then when you watched it, you kind of went, right, it's not exactly what I was expecting. But then you don't kind of know, what were you expecting? This is where I think Neil Jordan is the kind of director that does manage to surprise you no matter what he makes, because you always think you have an idea of what his stuff is, and it's only when he produces something new that you kind of go, oh, he's always challenging and evolving just that little way, that little bit in a direction that you can't fully anticipate. What I love about Byzantium, though, is that it does function as a film in its own right, absolutely. It has a very logical narrative, very, very strong performances. I like the fact it mixes up Anglo-Irish culture. It brings out very much the idea, as I say, of the Blackpool and Brighton spaces, and then contrasts that kind of sort of seedy, apologies if you're a native of any of those places, but you know, that sort of underbelly and the danger of being at the edge of the water, the culture at the edge of the water, the carnival space, all of that stuff, and mixes that up with not only traditional power in terms of patriarchy, but also again mixes that up with mythological spaces and places as you get with the island, which definitely stands in for sort of Irish culture. So with all of that in mind, I do think that the film actually has a lot more going on underneath, and that's what you see with the second and third viewing than at the first glance, where it might feel a bit sort of about tempestuous female vampires and the men who try to keep them in line. I think there's actually a lot more going on underneath that surface, and for that's why I think Jordan's ability to kind of foreground those narratives that we don't always take the time to listen to, I think that's what makes it a special film.
Circa, thank you so much for all of your time and all of your incredible insight into both of these films.
Thank you.
And where can people find more of your work online?
So if you're interested, I've been very busy over the last few years writing about vampires, of course, as always, and I continue to do so. So I have Postmodern Vampires, Film, Fiction and Popular Culture, which is a book out with Palgrave Macmillan, published in 2019. You'll see that George W. Bush and Lady Liberty are on the cover. And most recently, but in late 2020, I co-edited a volume with Xavier Aldana Reyes for the British Library called Visions of the Vampire, 200 Years of Immortal Tales. And that looks at vampire narratives from across the world, looking at various different ways in which the vampire has manifest. Some lost stories that have been republished for the first time in several decades, and some familiar ones in there as well. So perfect vampire reading, a vampire primer for you if you want to read some interesting undead fiction.
And an absolutely gorgeous edition. I still have it on
gorgeous.
I still have it right next to my bedside.
Yes, the BL did an absolutely beautiful job on that. And it's quite affordable as well. And usually academic books are not the cheapest things, but in the question of this, the BL have done a really beautiful production of this book, and it's quite affordable as well. You get it at the British
And that's
Library
it for this episode of the Final Girls podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. If you can, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps a lot. And if you want to find out more about what we do, go to thefinalgirls.co.uk, where you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter for newly commissioned original essays, and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at thefinalgirlsuk. As I mentioned at the start, if you can, please head over to patreon.com/thefinalgirls, where we will be posting bonus episodes and other goodies. You can also follow Circa on Twitter at VampireCirca, and I am on Twitter at AnnaBDemented. Thank you for listening, and next week, we've got our last full episode of the vampire season, where we will be covering A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night and What We Do in the Shadows. But don't worry, vampire obsessives, we've also got a couple of bonus episodes in the works.